Well, thank you very much, Chief Brissett. Good afternoon, elders, veterans, National Chief, members of the AFN Executive, Chiefs in Assembly. Before I go any further, I would want to recognize the Haudenosaunee, the Mohawk peoples on whose traditional territories we are gathering. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for giving me this invitation to be here to discuss the status, as Chief Brissett has just said, of First Nations education. Before I go any further, however, I would like just to say to some of you, I was up in northern Saskatchewan earlier in the week, and to those of you who come from any of the areas that have been affected by the forest fires, I want to express my own regret at the tragedies that are occurring. I also want to say I was up in Prince Albert where a lot of the evacuees came. And for those of you who have not been out there recently, I've got to say the courage of the people that I saw, all of those young families with those young children and all of those high school gymnasiums, it was quite something to see. And so I think that, tragic as this is, you all should feel very, very proud of your countrymen and women who were up there. So to begin where Tom left off, 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People issued its report on a wide range of areas, including education. It was one of the most important documents of its kind in Canadian history, and despite this, its impact was to remain limited. In 2006, after 18 months of negotiation, the Kelowna Accord was agreed to by the country's Indigenous leadership, by the premiers of the provinces and the territories, and the Prime Minister of Canada. Unfortunately, however, both the consultative approach and the substance of Kelowna were ignored by the new federal government that took office later in that year. And the $5 billion booked to eliminate the gaps in education in other areas was diverted elsewhere. Now, after that, as you know, much time passed. And then a couple of years later, the federal government agreed to re-engage with the First Nations to deal with the massive funding gaps in on-reserve education that had gotten much worse since the demise of the Kelowna Accord. At the beginning of these negotiations, there were hopeful signs. But at the end, the government simply dropped a piece of legislation on the table with no immediate new funding and the brutal admonition that it was the government's way or the highway. Finally, the most recent event in this saga came the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has just issued its historic report. It was a wake-up call to the country, and it was received with great enthusiasm by all of us, most of us hopeful that it represents a new beginning. Unfortunately, since then, however, the silence that has come from the government has been deafening, and the worry that history may now repeat itself is palpable. Now, my remarks to you today have but one purpose, and that is to say, this time, things must be different.
A month ago, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued its historic report. This call to the nation was received with great enthusiasm by millions of Canadians. But unfortunately, once again, the government remains silent and inactive. Members of the First Nations Assembly, things must change.
The recommendations of the TRC cannot be allowed to molder on some dusty archival shelf. Too much work went into those recommendations. Too much tragedy occurred of the lives of the students who went to the residential schools. And so the question we have today is how do Canadians make the recommendations of the TRC live? And the answer in terms of education is that you can make them live. You, if instead of seeking to debate some lifeless piece of legislation like C-33, which the government refuses to do anyway, if the First Nations build internal consensus and then you take the lead with your plan, showing the country how First Nations education could be so much better, and asking Canadians to join you in making it so. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. Why speak to Canadians? Quite simply, because Canadians want to be your partners. And because that's the only way that this government, which holds the purse strings, will get the message. And how do you take that message to Canadians? Well, you don't do it by seeking to amend Ottawa's proposed governance structures of First Nations education. You do it by setting out your own governance structure. You don't do it by waiting for Ottawa's experts to tell you what they can do. As the Grand Chief has said, there is no Department of Education, and I can tell you I was there, there are no education experts. You do it by having First Nations educators speak out, for they are among the best in the country, and they should be heard from across the land. In short, it's not enough to react to government proposals. You must take the lead. And if you do, Canadians will listen, and Canadians will back you, and no government will be able to turn you down. Now, the question is, why will Canadians come on side? Well, it's because we are a fair people. And when Canadians learn of the discrimination on education funding between two 6-year-olds going to two schools 10 kilometers apart, you just think about this. Two schools 10 kilometers apart, two 6-year-olds going into grade one receiving a government financial contribution up to 40% less than the other simply because he or she goes to an on-reserve school. I can tell you, when Canadians hear this, they are morally outraged, following which, when Canadians realize that these students make up the youngest and the fastest growing segment of our population, given that we are only 34 million people and we're competing with countries who count their populations in the hundreds of millions, Canadians ask themselves, what kind of economic lunacy is this? So, what will it take to seal the deal? Do you think, could I have a glass of water? Presumably one that Tom hasn't drunk with him. Thank you. Tom and I go a long way back. Question is, what will it take to seal a deal? I believe it will take for you, the leaders of the First Nations, to set out your own plan for successful education in a strong and united voice. A plan that explains why the First Nations must control their children's education. A plan that will show Canadians how you will run the system. A plan that stresses the importances of languages and culture. And a plan that has the top end of math, sciences, geography, history, and literature. A plan that speaks to your current successes. And I know, I visit a lot of First Nations schools, and the successes, despite the underfunding, are many. And then explains what First Nations education would look like if you received decent funding. Funding that would not only meet the need, but that would be provided on a consistent basis by the federal government as the provinces do for the public school system. It isn't only that First Nations schools are being underfunded. It's the fact is that for the last 5 years, every 6 months you get another notice that that funding is being cut. How in heaven's name can anybody build a school system if every time the mail comes in they shudder at getting another notice from Ottawa that your funding is being cut? It won't work. You can't do it. And it's not fair to the young people of this country. Alors, que faut-il faire pour réaliser?
So what must be done to carry out your strategy? There must be a strong plan set up by you to, in a determined way and common accord, a plan based on your current successes, which are numerous, and which explain in detail what education of the First Nations would be with adequate financing.
Bring First Nations education to its property level be costly? Of course it will in the short term. but it would be a heck of a lot less costly than what do we see today when young lives are wasted. The government says it wants to invest in a strong economy. Well, let me tell you, there is no return on investment that can top a government dollar invested in a young person's learning. When you come up with the plan, and when Canadians get behind us, and we're all going to be there arguing about this, and when governments talk about the cost of it, the question to really ask is, what's the cost of not doing it? What's the cost of denying a young person a decent shot at life? What's the cost of basically saying to somebody that just because they went to a First Nation school, they're not entitled to go on to university or to become a plumber or whatever you want? That is not my country. It's not your country. It's not Canadians' country. Now, there are two questions that you might want to ask at this point. The first is, why am I so convinced that better funding will deliver better results? And the answer is, I have spent a good portion of the last 8 years with Indigenous educators and students, and I can attest to what they can do when they're properly funded. And I'd just like to tell you about 3 of the programs that we have started to demonstrate what I mean. 6 years ago, we set up the Aboriginal Youth Entrepreneurship Program at Dennis Franklin Cromartie First Nation School in Thunder Bay. Its purpose is to teach entrepreneurship. It's to teach financial literacy. It's to teach economic opportunity. Is the course a success? Yes, it is. We're now in 46 schools across the country, and we continue to grow. A number of those schools are in your backyards. Now, why is the course a success? Well, there are many reasons, but I will tell you the one that really strikes me. About 4 years ago, I was in one of the schools, and a young OG Cree student came up to me and asked me, why didn't we have more Indigenous entrepreneurs in our examples? He said to me, you got entrepreneurs from Montreal or from Toronto and Vancouver, but the fact is, why don't you have them coming from some of our communities? And suddenly, light went on in my head. And as a result, we have produced the first set of high school workbooks and textbooks, business workbooks, business textbooks, ever written for Indigenous students by Indigenous teachers about Indigenous entrepreneurs. And what I would simply say, when people talk about culture, I think we should understand that what the culture is and the worldview of Aboriginal Canada is, it's very deep and it's very profound. But there are different ways in which we all do business, and there are tremendous successes, tremendous entrepreneurs, tremendous successful businessmen and women out there. And they also come from that same worldview, and they come from that same culture. And these students who are taking our course, it's the one thing that they talk about, is how they feel at home when they see how their own people have done. And so my point is quite simple, that if you want a student to succeed, then give them a chance to learn within their own culture and their own context. The second program that I would talk to you about is called the Principles Course. This was a program set up by Dr. Carolina Lindman, who a number of you have probably met. She's our Director of Education. And what she is doing is leading a partnership of 13 Indigenous education experts, a number of whom you know, in conjunction with the University of Toronto's Faculty of Education. The purpose of the course was suggested to us by a number of principals on a number of schools in the reserves across the country. And what they said is, why don't you give us a course that will provide us with extensive professional development while we're on the job? Under the best of circumstances, running a school isn't very easy. You know that. But doing so on an underfunded reserve school, or even more to the point, in a school in a remote community, is a task worthy of every support any of us can ever bring. Judging from those who've seen the models, the Principles Course, when the pilot begins this September, because the first pilot is going to be in September, will make a major contribution of empowering on-reserve education from the inside of a school where it counts most. In other words, what we hope this course will show is that which we must never forget, and that is investing in educators who are on the front lines is essential to student success. Over the course of the last number of years, we have spent, and there are a number of people in this room who understand this, an awful lot of academic work on what must be taught and how it must be taught. But the fact is that on some of these remote schools and some of these communities, when you're a long way from the ability to talk to anybody else, the pressures are tremendous, and you know about those. And it is really up to all of us to support the teachers and the principals in these schools. And what we hope is that this course will do that. And then the final example that I would give you is the one that Chief Brissett, just talked about. The point really is to show how funding does make the difference. This was a literacy program, which we completed, as Tom said, on 2 reserve schools, Walpole Island First Nation and the Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. Let me just go back to this. If a child hasn't learned to read and write by grade 3, they will play catch-up the rest of their lives. The fact of the matter is, reading and writing is the essential part of any ability to grow and to learn. The province of Ontario, about 10 years ago, recognizing that its literacy rates were not very good, developed a whole new program in order basically to teach literacy, making sure that when the kids would graduate at the end of, or not graduate, would pass from grade 3 to grade 4, that they could read and write. And the school had tremendous results. So as a result of this, I went to the then Minister of Education, now Premier Wynne, and asked if I could have the course. And then I asked if I could have the people, some of the people, and we would hire them aboard, the people who actually implemented the course. And she said yes, and we did. And as Tom just said to you, and this is really significant, the average ability of to read and write at a comprehensive level by grade 3 in Ontario schools is 70% of the students are able to do so. The average on reserve at the end of grade 3 in Ontario is 13%. And the average in Kettle, Stony Point, and at Walpole Island was that 13%. So when we took this course, and we took it into those 2 schools, 70% of Ontarians could read and write by end of grade 3, 13% at Walpole and Kettle and Stony Point could read. 4.5 years later, when we went back and they did the testing, extensive testing, at kids at the end of grade 3, 70% of the kids at Walpole and the kids at Kettle and Stony Point. In other words, what happened in a 4-year period, the literacy rate was brought from 13% to where, in terms of reading, they were at the provincial average, and in terms of writing, they were at the provincial average. And in fact, and I see some of the women here, for the young women at Walpole and First Nations, they were reading at a better level than the Ontario young women were reading at. Now you think about what that means. You think of what that means. What that means is that there are over 500 kids in those 2 schools who can now read and write and have got a better chance than they ever would have had. And so the question is, we're now receiving requests from right across the country for this course. And you might well ask, why isn't it being introduced into every school that wants it across the country? Well, that's what should happen. That's what Ontario did. What Ontario did, they introduced it in 100 schools right off the bat in Ontario when they found that it was succeeding. And it's in fact now part of the regular programming in Ontario, and Ontario's literacy rates keep rising. Now the same rationale, I believe, should be applied to First Nations schools. But why isn't it? Well, the answer is it's not, because the federal government is the only institution that has the funding to make that happen. And examples like this, the fact is that kids across this country are being deprived from the ability to read and write as on reserve because the federal government refuses to do it. And the question is, there can be no better example than why the discrimination and on-reserve funding by the federal government has got to end. How can the government of Canada deprive a group of 6-year-olds of the same opportunity to learn to read and write as other 6-year-olds have. It makes no sense. And ladies and gentlemen, it is morally wrong. It's disgraceful. And this brings me to my last point. Pourquoi suis-je convaincu que si les Premières Nations présentent un plan complet?
I'm convinced that if the government present a solid plan, Canadians are willing to welcome, because
All of you, and say that if the First Nations set out a comprehensive plan for their children's education, Canadians will support you and you will get the funding. It's because of the kind of people across this country who want you to succeed, people who already support you and to whom Canadians will listen. Let me just go through a list. The Canadian Federation of Teachers is there for you. The Universities Canada, this is the association of all the Canadians in Canada, are there for you. This is public. This is not just private conversation. They've all come out publicly for you. People for Education is there for you. The Learning Partnership is there for you. The Canadian Education Association is there for you. And they're just the beginning of the list of education organizations from coast to coast to coast who are there for you. For instance, in the terms of the provincial departments of education, I have never spoken to a provincial education official who would not support you and would not support you when you take this to the Canadian people. This because, unlike Ottawa, which has no Ministry of Education, the provinces understand what you're going through, and they understand how expensive education is. And the provinces already have partnerships with a number of you already. And indeed, for most provinces, their success is tied to yours, and they will not let you down. À travers toutes les conversations que j'ai eues avec les ministres,
through all the conversations I had with the provincial officials, not one doesn't support us, contrary to Ottawa, that doesn't have a Ministry of Education for provinces and territories. You'll understand very well what I'm saying.
earlier I was in Saskatchewan. I was at the annual meeting of the Canadian School Boards. These are among the most important elected educators and education administrators in the country. And so I asked them at the meeting, I said, where do you stand in terms of First Nations education on reserve? And they came out strongly at their meeting. Support for you right across the country. Hier, moi, j'ai parlé au doyen des facultés d'éducation.
I spoke to the Dean of Education during their annual meeting, and I asked them, are you willing to participate in a process that's transparent and successful for you?
Canada's universities came to an agreement among themselves, which they called the Accord on Indigenous Education. A month ago, I spoke to the deans at their annual meeting. I asked them if they would support you if you took the lead with your own comprehensive education plan. Their answer was unequivocal. Yes, they said, without hesitation. And then they referred me to their accord, in which they say, and I like to quote, this is from the Dean's Accord, our vision is that Indigenous identities, cultures, languages, values, ways of knowing, and knowledge systems must flourish in all Canadian learning settings. It doesn't get any stronger than that. Members of the Assembly, I should stop now, but I'm going to just give me 2 more minutes. My father always taught me when he was giving a speech, my father was in politics, he always said, if you're going on too long, tell them you're going to stop, and they'll listen, you can go on forever. But let me just, I'm so honored that you have given me this opportunity to speak to you. I'm here to join with you as you speak out for education. And I ask you to do it with one strong voice. I ask you to speak out as you have, in a voice that builds on the treaties. I ask you to speak out as you have in a voice that builds on the inherent right. But I also ask you to speak as well in a voice that builds on the economic reality that a nation of what 34 million people cannot afford to waste a single talent. I ask you to speak out for Canada's sake in a voice that reminds us all that the discrimination in funding by the government of Indigenous education is contrary to every single value this country stands for. Le gouvernement fédéral a l'argent.
The federal government have the money, but you have the knowledge, the experts, your own unique experiences. And these are your children.
You have the knowledge, you have the experts, you have the experience, and the students we are talking about are your children. And if somebody asks you a second time why it is so important, don't go into a lot of detail, don't go into a lot of study. Simply tell them it's because you love your children as much as any Canadian loves theirs, and you want your children to have every opportunity that any other Canadian child will have. What should your message be? It's quite simple. What should your message be? It's quite simple. It's Chief Tom Brissett who gave it when the results of our literacy project were announced, and he mentioned it this morning. Chief was asked by somebody from the audience, by a newspaper person. He said, what do these results prove? What Tom Brissett said, and I think it is the message we should take to the country, it proves that when you give our children the tools, our students will do the job. And Tom Brissett was right. Thank you very much.